All right, testing, 1, 2, 3, testing, 1, 2, 3. I guess I'm on. All right, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Things look a little more normal. We have tables. Isn't that great? And snacks. So we can have snacks if they're individually wrapped. So yeah, making progress. Little by little. So yeah, those of you at home, if the live stream is working yet, yeah, you can come back whenever you feel comfortable. Well, let's have a word of prayer. Thanks, Father, for this opportunity. We thank you for the changes that are happening in our world, and that we're working back towards some kind of normalcy. Thank you for the opportunity to gather together and to study your word and to ask important questions and sometimes hard questions. We just thank you for this in Jesus' name, amen. So last week we started in on 1 Timothy 3:1 and following, and looking at the requirements or qualifications for elders. And didn't quite finish that section, so we'll finish that, and then it moves right into the qualifications for deacons. But I wanted to start with a question. How many of you in your experiences with different churches have had been in churches where there were problems with leadership, elders, pastors? Okay. It's a pretty common thing, isn't it? And I think one of the blessings of being here at the chapel, I mean, my wife and I came in 1988, is that things have been fairly smooth here. Wouldn't you say, Charlie? Yeah. The transition from, Pastor Bill to Pastor Chris went very smoothly, all things considered, and that's partly to Bill's credit, but there haven't been any big church splits here over those years that I've been here, so that's a blessing. But it isn't that way everywhere, as some of you already know. So a little review there as we looked into, what were the qualifications for a potential elder candidate. One of my favorite New Testament scholars, Luke Timothy Johnson, has a good summary of some of the key qualities that we talked about last week. Given the sort of authority assumed here, it is noteworthy that other attributes expected in a supervisor are ameliorative, that's a great word, moral qualities that mitigate against any hint of arbitrary or harsh use of power. To be nonviolent and not given to battle, that was a word that we talked about last week, amakos, not someone who's given to strife or struggle or battle. Remember I talked about Machiavelli, whose name is based on that very word. Means that the leader is not corrupted by envy and vainglory and is able to cultivate cooperation rather than competition, foment peace rather than conflict. So I like that, cooperation versus competition. And there really needs to be a balance there, because, I hear stories from different people all the time about, churches they're serving in where, there's these extremes of elders being too controlling or elders being not involved enough, right? Not holding people accountable, not holding the pastor accountable. And so there's a balance there that needs to be found in that. So I'll go ahead and read that section again, 3:1 through 7. Here's a trustworthy saying: if anyone sets his heart on being an overseer, he desires a noble task. Now the overseer must be above reproach, husband of one wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. So, Toby, can you turn it down just a little? I don't know. If I get kind of excited, it's gonna throw me off. So we got through, I think, just really the first 3 verses. So verse 4 starts the next section. And Paul here is now shifting from kind of these personal character qualities to various abilities, particularly in relation to the management of his own home. And so, how can an overseer manage others in the church? How can he have relationships with outsiders if he has trouble even managing those under his closest authority within the home? So it's interesting because Paul then talks about being an overseer of your own personal qualities first, and then kind of works his way outward to the family and then to the church. So the circles of a good reputation extend outward even further to those outside the church, so that those who represent the church might draw unbelievers to the faith by their blameless character and wise example. So management of home life, manages his own household well. So again, here, Paul sees this important correlation between how a person directs the affairs of their home and how they direct the affairs of the church. And you can see the perfect little family over there in the cartoon. Of course, there's this myth of the perfect family, and which we'll talk about in a little bit. But, the kinds of expectations here and understandings of how you control yourself versus how you control and motivate others was even something you see in the Greco-Roman world. There's a quote from Sophocles: "If then I nurse rebellion in my house, shall I not also foster mutiny without? For whoever who rules his household in worthy fashion will prove in civic matters no less wise." Now, the next thing that Paul says then is that the potential elder should have evidence in his home of obedient, respectful children. Well, this has proven to be a very challenging and a debated requirement for office, with questions in various churches and settings of, how does my child's behavior and life choices impact my ability to lead in the church, right? And if that's not enough, Titus, we have the same qualifications in Titus for elders, basically, but Titus is even more specific, right? Having children who believe. So what does that mean? If one of my kids doesn't follow in the faith, that I can't be an elder or I can't be a pastor? These are very difficult things. How should a church respond when the pastor's own children are rebellious or reject the faith? And there's that proverb that people always bring up, Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go, and what? And when he's old, he won't depart from it. Well, number one, Proverbs are rules of thumb, right? They're not promises. They don't always work. 2, it says train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, it doesn't say when he's a teenager. But even with that, there are very godly families who have dysfunctions, who have dysfunctional children. And I was reading an interesting article about pastors whose children have walked away from the faith. And one very prominent one is John Piper, if you've heard of John Piper. And he has a son named Abraham Piper, which I think was purposeful because there's this famous Dutch theologian or reformer called Abraham Kuyper. This was like, I'm going to name him Abraham. And it sounds like Kuyper, but... Abraham, was part of the church and then fell away from the church and then came back to the church. Actually, he was excommunicated from the church, okay? So imagine that as a parent, as the pastor, having to excommunicate your own kid. Then he came back to the church, restored to the church, and then guess what happened? He went away again. And he has this little blog where he talks about, Christians and former Christians and so on. There's a Barna survey that they did a few years ago called Why Do Pastors' Kids Leave the Church? And it says 40% of pastors' kids went through a period where they significantly doubted their faith. 33% are no longer actively involved in church. 7% no longer consider themselves to be Christians. Well, those numbers are a bit skewed because this survey was only done through asking the actual parents or the pastors. It wasn't done by asking the children, right? So the numbers could be even higher. It says here, I guess none of the pastors think it's possible that their children would ever say to them, Dad, I believe you've dedicated your life to a lie. Whoa. There's actually a website called the Clergy Project. And you can go online, and it's a website for former pastors or former people of any kind of religious affiliation who have basically walked away from their beliefs or walked away from their faith. So on the opening page on this website, are you a religious professional who no longer believes in the supernatural? Have you remained in vocational ministry secretly hiding away your non-belief? Are you struggling over where to go from here with your life and career? If this is you, we invite you to join the Clergy Project. So people go on there and they post these little videos of, this is what I used to do. I used to be a pastor, and now I'm not. And I hear these stories myself. I mean, there's someone I know in the church, a young person who was part of a church back east, and when the husband and wife were co-pastors in this church. And when they retired, they divorced and went their separate ways. And they just put up with it until the kids were out of the house and the ministry was done. And it's like, okay, we're done. And it's like, I have a hard time understanding that kind of worldview, personally. This article in Christianity Today about John Piper's son, it was interesting because he was very forthright about the struggles and so on. There has been some controversy about whether or not he should have stepped down from the pastoral role according to the scriptural guidelines set forth in 1 Timothy 3, 4, and 5 and Titus 1:6. I found Piper's vulnerability and tenderness refreshing. Here's why. It reminds me that no one, not even the best Christian hedonist, can guarantee that his or her son or daughter won't stray from the faith. Although it doesn't make sense, parents who've done everything right have rebellious and sometimes highly dysfunctional children. There's an article on Christianity Today called The Myth of the Perfect Parent. And in that, the author says, am I parenting successfully? Actually, I should start a little earlier. She wisely advises us to quit asking ourselves, am I parenting successfully? And quit asking, are others parenting successfully? Instead, we need to ask, am I parenting faithfully? Okay, because, success is a very different animal from the idea of being faithful in teaching and guiding our children. And, I have 5 boys, and I'll have to say not all of them are walking with the Lord at this point. And it's a very sad thing. And we have great relationships with our kids, but we hope, as probably many of you hope, that someday down the road, those things will change. Another aspect of that is pastors who get so involved in ministry that they neglect their families. And I remember I had a student from Ukraine years ago at Trinity Lutheran, Julia, and she talked about how this, when she was living in Ukraine, that this pastor from Sweden would come over all the time, an evangelist, and he would come and speak at various churches. And this is how she came to know the Lord. And yet, later she would tell me that his family was just a disaster. Divorcing, kids just off the rails or whatever, because he never spent any time with his family. He was always out doing the work of the Lord, right? So there needs to be some accountability there, some balance. Experience in the faith, verse 6. Paul says, not a recent convert. The Greek word is neophyte, which literally means not newly planted there. So, and it's interesting because in the Titus list of the same, qualifications basically for elders, Paul doesn't say this. And I talked about this a little bit last week because the church in Crete that Titus is there to help seems to be a newly planted mission church. So there isn't really, a lot of opportunity for, people who have been believers in Jesus for years and years and years. And it's very different with the Ephesian church here, which has been going on for a generation. And we already know from Acts 20 that Paul already has a series of elders there that he has organized. The other issue there at the end is the hasty promotion of naturally gifted leaders and speakers can lead to an overinflated ego and also foster a personality cult syndrome, which Paul had to counteract in Corinth and which plagues many megachurches today. That phrase there, he may become conceited, the NIV says, but the NRSV says puffed up, which is a little bit more accurate because it in the Greek, it has the idea of being filled with smoke. It's kind of an interesting metaphor, right? It's like, wow, you see, and matter of fact, you go to some of these mega churches and they have like smoke machines, right? It's like, and the pastor walks out, it's like, wow, filled with smoke. It gives me another perspective on that. Paul had to deal with that in Corinth. So people saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Peter, I'm of Christ. And we see that with mega churches where these pastors, wow, look at all these thousands of people I'm teaching. And, look at this infrastructure that we've built here. And sometimes they go off the rails or they turn away from the faith, like Rob Bell, for example. Very gifted speaker. I mean, you listen to that guy before he left. He was just very charismatic. And Paul's saying, yeah, be careful here because you might fall under the judgment of the devil. And we don't really know exactly what Paul means by that. There are different interpretations of that. What might it mean to fall into the judgment? The Greek word's more judgment of the devil. And the word for devil is diabolos, so if you know Spanish. And it doesn't just mean devil. It can mean accuser, slanderer. So sometimes there's a little bit of ambiguity in the word. And so to fall under the judgment of the devil could mean three different things. You could fall under the same judgment that the devil fell under himself, right? Because of his pride and his arrogance. Secondly, you could fall under the judgment or accusation that the devil himself would bring against you. Okay, and we see that in the book of Job. You also see that in Revelation 12, where the devil has accusations against the saints there. Thirdly, Paul talks about earlier in this letter in 1:20, he talks about Hymenaeus and Alexander, who are these false teachers in the church, who he's handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. So this is the idea we've talked about of being disciplined in the church, and to be kicked out of the church basically and put back into the sphere of influence of Satan for the purpose of teaching and correcting and hopefully bringing people back. So I'm not really sure which of those I believe about it. The first two probably make more sense than the third one. So verse 7 then, relationship with unbelievers. So Paul says that the potential elder should have a good reputation with outsiders, not just within his family, not just with himself, not just within the church. And so this is something that Paul's concerned about throughout the pastoral letters. And I've talked about this word cosmeo that he uses there. It's where we get the word cosmetics, is that the church is attractive to people, right? It's like a beautiful bracelet. It's like a beautiful necklace, which people go, wow, where'd you get that? And you're looking at the church going, I'd like to be a part of that. And particularly in an honor-shame culture that we're talking about here in the Middle East, the bad example of one member serves to tarnish the image of the whole community of faith and hinders the attractiveness, there's that word cosmeo, to the outsiders looking in, right? So the outsiders are looking in. There's another problem, too, of how the insiders are looking out, right? How they're looking out at the culture, how they're responding to the culture. And I remember, how many of you have ever read The Grapes of Wrath? Steinbeck's great novel, yeah. So about the great migration, the Okies and so on. And there's an interesting passage in that book where Steinbeck is describing how they stopped for the night, and they put up the tents, and then there's a tent where they get all the musicians together and they start playing these fancy reels with the violin or the fiddles, and people start dancing, and everybody's having fun and enjoying it. But then he describes the Christians who are not there, part of that, right? But they're outside the tent. Now the dusk was falling. As the darkness deepened, the practicing of the string band seemed to grow louder. The lights flashed on, and two men inspected the patched wire to the dance floor. The children crowded thickly about the musicians. A boy with a guitar sang the down-home blues, chording delicately for himself. And on his second chorus, 3 harmonicas and a fiddle joined in. From the tents, the people streamed toward the platform, men in their clean blue denim and women in their ginghams. They came near to the platform and then stood quietly waiting, their faces bright and intent under the light. The string band took up a real tune and played loudly, for they were not practicing anymore. In front of their tents, the Jesus lovers sat and watched, their faces hard and contemptuous. They did not speak to one another. They watched for sin, and their faces condemned the whole proceeding. Is that how we want to look to people? Is that going to attract people into the body of Christ? In 1 Corinthians 5, Paul has to correct the Corinthians because he sent a letter to them that we don't have anymore, where they misunderstood what he said. They thought he said, don't hang around with unbelievers anymore. Don't hang around with these sinners. And he lists all these various sins, right? And Paul has to say, no, I didn't mean that. I meant don't hang around with a believer who does that. And then he says, what business is it of mine to judge outsiders? It's not my business. It's not our business as Christians to try to make non-Christians do Christian things, right? There's a great quote here from Joette Bassler. What is most remarkable about this discussion of the bishop and deacons is what is not present. There is no theological grounding of these positions, no list of duties associated with them apart from verse 9, no spiritual requirements for them. Instead, the lists promote as qualifications for church leadership roles the moral virtues of the Greco-Roman world, though to be sure the very highest of these virtues. The goal of this was in large part apologetic. These church leaders represent the church to an unbelieving society, and through their exemplary lives, they could deflect the hostility that new cults often faced. In particular, the stable households of these men and women not only stood as a testimony to their leadership skills, but also silenced any suspicion among outsiders that the new cult would undermine family structure and thus threaten the social foundation of the orderly and stable empire. So Christians here are called to be models to the outside world in how they direct their own lives, how they direct the lives of their families, how they direct the lives of the church itself. So then Paul shifts to qualifications for deacons in verse 8, and I'll go ahead and read that. Deacons likewise are to be men worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must first be tested, and then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. In the same way, their wives, or the same word could be translated women, probably here we're talking about deacons, which I'll talk about, deaconesses, are to be women worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. A deacon must be the husband of but one wife and must manage his children and his household well. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. So, as I talked about last week, a lot of these character qualities here for the elders and the deacons are very similar to each other. And also that many of these qualities that are listed here are just those that are expected of believers in general. Okay, so they're not unique to leadership qualities. They're the kinds of things that all believers should kind of be working towards in their lives. So Paul here now uses a word, deacon or diakonos in the Greek, which often is translated kind of in the general sense of a servant. And there could be a variety of servants who have other kind of specific titles. So prophets, apostles, evangelists, they could all be called servants. In Acts 6, we have the 7 men who are chosen, the magnificent 7, because there's a problem with the feeding of the widows. And so the Hebrew widows are getting more food than the Greek-speaking widows, and there's a little bit of a tension in the church there. And so these 7 men, who are all Hellenists, who are all Greek speakers, are chosen to help alleviate that. But it's kind of interesting because Luke never actually says that they go and do that. It never talks about them going to wait on tables, because the apostles go, well, it's not our job to wait on tables. Well, Jesus did say you could kind of be a servant and serve a table, but these guys are chosen for that. But what Luke then does is he tells us about 2 of them, Stephen, right, and Philip, and he calls Philip the evangelist. And what are they doing? Well, Stephen is speaking, right? He's giving a defense of the followers of Jesus, and he ends up losing his life for that, right? Philip is preaching to the Ethiopian eunuch. And in that passage, it says that, these guys are performing signs and wonders, right? Speaking, teaching, evangelism. So sometimes churches today will look at this passage in Acts 6 and say, well, these are deacons. Well, it never actually says they're deacons. And if they're deacons, they're doing things that normal deacons here don't do, at least the way we look at it today. So kind of have to be careful of how we understand the word. Moving to the back, and my printer flipped it on its end, so you have to flip it over for some reason. The special use of the word diakonos here, instead of just the general word servant, for the idea of a formal office, the deacon, is only found in Philippians 1:1, so where Paul writes to the overseers and deacons, and then in our passage here in 1 Timothy, and then probably also the special sense of deacon or deaconess is used in Romans 16:1, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The role of deacon seems to involve assisting the elders in various capacities. and perhaps a deacon who has served well, as Paul says here, might be considered for the office of the elder, especially since the qualifications for both are very similar. So what's interesting, though, is that when you look at the evidence here in this passage and you look at the New Testament evidence, there doesn't seem to be a very strict differentiation in the kinds of tasks. Like today, we generally associate deacons with kind of these more practical duties in the church, right? Where the elders are doing like the spiritual stuff. That kind of distinction is not really clear here. Is that deacons could also be involved in speaking. They could also be involved in teaching. So we kind of have to be careful there. Now, as you move into the 2nd century, there does seem to be a little bit more stratification in what deacons do. So we learn that deacons served in distributing communion, helping with the agape meal, right, the full meal deal that the church had together before they took communion. Serving communion, distributing relief money to the needy, visiting those sick and in prison, burying the dead, even helping widows. I mean, at one point, the church in Rome had 5,000 widows on its list. Okay? They are serving the community. They're serving those who are in need. And so, of course, you need people in ministry to work in those areas. Even later, deacons became more prominent than elders. It's kind of interesting to look at this because what happens, as I mentioned last week, is that at first you had just deacons and elders, right, within a local community. But then one of the elders rises up and you have this stratification of the bishop of a community or a local series of house churches. And then you have the elders and the deacons. And the deacons were the ones that helped the bishop. So then they became even more important than the elders in some ways. So the next list there, I'm not going to really unpack that because most of these we talked about last week in the relationship to the elders. But again, Paul's concerned about personal character, worthy of respect, dignified, not double-tongued. It's somebody who says one thing to one person and then says something to the other. And it's interesting because the NIV has turned this little phrase around and turned it into a positive, right? And it literally in the Greek is not this. And the NIV says, no, be sincere, which kind of to me waters it down a little bit. And of course, this goes back to kind of the wisdom tradition. If you read Proverbs or you read any kind of Jewish wisdom traditions like Sirach I've talked about, which is, he was a rabbi named Jesus 200 years before Jesus of Nazareth. I put a little quote there from Sirach. Curse the gossips and the double-tongued, for they destroy the peace of many. All right. So Paul says, yeah, that's not a good quality for a deacon. Not overindulging in wine. So again, very similar to the role of elders. I heard a story recently of I was actually a pastor, but in a very big mega church who had to leave the church because he was just addicted to alcohol. Very gifted speaker. People followed him, but eventually just kind of crashed and burned. Not one who will do anything for a profit. I like the King James Version. Not greedy for filthy lucre. It sounds like pirate talk or something. Arg, you're not guilty for filthy lucre. Proven experience in the faith. So an unwavering commitment to the basic gospel. And here Paul has this interesting phrase that he uses, hold fast, someone who holds fast to the mystery of the faith. And the Greek word for mystery, there's mysterion. It's very similar. And it's a favorite word of Paul's that you see especially in the book of Ephesians. And so he can use it in various ways. And it's almost always related to the idea of God's plan of redemption. That wasn't really made clear until Jesus came. And so now this mystery has been unveiled. It's been released. So he can say the mystery of God, or the mystery of Christ, the mystery of his will, the mystery of the gospel. And in particular, one of the main facets of that mystery for Paul is the full inclusion of non-Jews, of Gentiles, into the community of faith without having to follow all the circumcision and food purity and the various ritual laws. So it's important that the deacon here understands that basic idea of the gospel message. But they should also be tested. So if there's nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. So there's no tenure, in eldership. There's no tenure in deacons. It's always kind of qualified. And then Paul jumps, interestingly, kind of jumps to women in verse 11, and then back to deacons in verse 12. So it's okay, what's he doing here? And so there's some debate there. Is he talking about the wives of deacons? Because the word can be wives or women in general, the same Greek word. Or is he specifically here talking about women who are in the office of a deacon or a deaconess, right? And the evidence overall really seems to point to the idea that here he's talking about some kind of official capacity for women in the church. Not just that the wives of deacons have to be like this, because he doesn't have a corresponding qualification for wives of elders, right? Why go through all the elders and not talk about their wives? Here he seems to be talking to deacons and then to women who are going to serve in a very similar role. And the way Paul uses the grammar here, the word likewise in Greek and so on, seems to point to the idea of deaconesses. So Thomas Oden states, there can be no doubt, however, that these were women in ministry requiring qualifications for service, whose qualifications were set right beside those of male deacons. Okay, so male deacons, female deacons, and we seem to have an example of that in Romans 16:1 and 2 with a woman named Phoebe. Paul says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon, diakonos. Now, some translations will do it more generically. They'll say servant, but the context seems to suggest that she has more than just a generic kind of servant role. Paul gives her the letter of Romans that he's just written and says, Phoebe, can you take this to Rome? And when you get to Rome, maybe you might have to explain some things in this letter, right? Last year, one of my classes for Fuller, I had them read a historical novel called Phoebe. It was written by Paula Gooder. She's a British New Testament scholar. And just kind of recreates, in a dramatic kind of way, what it might be like to be this woman, Phoebe. And what it might be like to take this letter to Rome and to meet the church and the house churches of Rome and what's going on at that time period. I'll probably quote from it. There's some interesting parallels to the pastorals as we kind of move through there. Help her in whatever she may require of you, for she has been a benefactor of many and of myself as well. So the word benefactor there is really a technical term for someone who has significant resources, someone who has a high position in the culture and uses those for the sake of other people. We see the same thing in Luke 8:1-3, where it talks about Jesus and his male disciples, who then are also followed by a group of women. And Luke says, and then the women are paying for the guys. They're using their resources as benefactors to the men who have left their jobs, right, to follow this guy all around Palestine. A little bit later, in the early 2nd century, we have this very famous letter from the Roman governor Pliny. He's a governor of Bithynia, which is just north, really, of Ephesus area in Asia Minor. And he's having some problems with these pesky Christians. He doesn't know what to do. And so he writes to the Emperor Trajan, and we have this whole letter about, what do I do? Here's what I've been doing, and, I've killed some of them, and I wonder if I should keep doing that, Trajan. This has made me decide it was all the more necessary to extract the truth by torture from 2 slave women who they call deaconesses. I found nothing but a degenerate sort of cult carried to extreme lengths. Okay. Well, to be a deaconess is dangerous here, right? You could get yourself into a lot of trouble and perhaps lose your life. So we see that there was a very specific office there for deaconesses. And Tobin, do you have that little overhead thing? I put on some quotes from the early 2nd century about deacons and deaconesses. So the Didache is an early church order, actually written before the end of the end of the 1st century. So some of the Didache is probably written around the same time as some of the later Gospels. Okay. So he says, appoint therefore for yourselves bishop, episkopos, which is the word that Paul uses here, and deacons, diakonos, worthy of the Lord, meek men, not lovers of money, is the same word that's used in our passage, aphilargeros, not a lover of silver, and truthful and approved, for they also minister to you the ministry, liturgia. What does that sound like? Liturgy, okay? So it's not just like handing out money, of the prophets and teachers. Therefore, do not despise them. First Clement was the Bishop of Rome in the mid-90s AD, writing around the same time as John in Revelation. He writes to the Corinthians, actually, like 50 chapters to the Corinthians. And as the apostles went through the territories and townships preaching, they appointed their first converts after testing them by the Spirit to be bishops and deacons for the believers of the future. All right, so one of the goals here is, well, the apostles are gone. They're not going to be around forever. We need to have other leaders that step into these important roles. And we actually learn the name of one of the Ephesian elders, Ignatius, who's the bishop of Antioch, just a little bit later in the 110, 112 AD. He writes to all these churches in that area as he's on his way to Rome to get martyred. He says, now concerning my fellow servant Burrus, your deacon by the will of God. Okay, and he actually mentions the names of several deacons of various churches in that time period. Ignatius, again, writing to the church called the Philadelphians. That's where our city of Philadelphia got its name. It was a town in Asia Minor. Since it is reported to me that the church which is in Antioch in Syria is in peace, it is proper for you as a church of God to appoint a deacon to go as an ambassador of God to it, to congratulate those who are gathered there and to glorify the name. Okay, so visiting other churches, other groups of believers, to encourage them. A little bit later, probably we're talking 3rd century here, there's apostolic constitutions, which gives a lot of kind of guidelines for leadership and how to work church. Ordain also a deaconess who is faithful and holy for the ministrations towards women. For sometimes the bishop cannot send a deacon who is a man to the women, on account of unbelievers. Okay, there's this problem of image to outsiders. And it's kind of like the earliest Billy Graham rule here, where, if you're ministering to a woman by herself, maybe you should send a woman. And especially here, part of this is because in baptisms, they baptized naked in the early church. Okay? And so what he's saying, if you go on to read the fuller context, is, well, the women should be there to help the women, and the men, you guys stay out. For we stand in need of a woman, a deaconess, for many necessities. For example, in the baptism of women, for there is no necessity that the women should be seen by the men. Yeah, you guys stay behind the curtain there during the baptism. Well, we need to wrap it up here. He continues on then with the more qualifications for the deacons: worthy of respect, dignified, not malicious talkers, slanderers, temperate, trustworthy in all things. Oh, actually, that's for the women, sorry. That's for the deaconesses. Then back to the deacons with D there, right? Deacons. Management of home life. One wife husband or one woman man. We talked about that with, it's the same phrase that we see with the elders earlier. And again, managing their household and children well. Those who serve well as deacons gain a good standing for themselves and great boldness. And that's the NRSV translation there. Boldness there does have this sense of speaking boldly. Okay? So the NIV assurance kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit vaguer there. So boldness, you think of Stephen, right? A boldness in speech. So what we're seeing here, if you want to kind of diagram it, is that Paul's concerned, that the elders and deacons are able to properly manage themselves, right? Their own character. And then that works out to the home. Can they properly oversee the home? And that works out to overseeing the church. But then for Paul, there's another important facet of that is how do they look to unbelievers? How is the unbelieving public and people in the city where the house church is, how are they looking at this, right? Because the goal is that these people then will be part of this circle here, right? And maybe eventually, they'll have their own house church. Maybe eventually they'll be elders and deacons. Now, what happens in the early church, of course, down through history is you have increased stratification of positions in the church. You have, go from elders and deacons to elders and deacons and bishops. You go from elders and deacons and bishops to archbishops. You go to the Pope, and everything, becomes kind of stratified and increased hierarchy there. And so when Luther came along, who grew up in that system, one of his emphases later was what we call the priesthood of all believers. The idea that there shouldn't be this big distinction between clergy and laity. And he didn't say there couldn't be bishops or, pastors or whatever. But really it's the calling of every believer to be a priest in some sense, right? And it's the same as Israel in the Old Testament in Exodus 19, where you have the covenant. It says, you shall be a kingdom of priests. It doesn't mean the Levites. It means the whole nation is a kingdom of priests. You're mediators. You're intercessors. So there's a little quote there about Luther. Martin Luther argued for the abolition of any distinction between a sacramentally ordained priesthood and the universal priesthood of the laity. Every believer, Luther argued, shared in the corporate priesthood of the people of God by virtue of their baptism. Every believer was a priest, but not every believer was called to exercise the office and work of a priest. For Luther, ordained clergy were essentially office holders who were elected and could be removed from office by the local congregation. And so that's an important, I think, element. I kind of grew up in the Church of Christ, as I mentioned, and Church of Christ has this really strong emphasis on the priesthood of believers. It's important because, when I was teaching some classes where I had a lot of unbelievers in the class, adults, I was actually teaching in hospitals for SPU, for nursing department, but they had to take religious classes, right? So I do a survey. It's a 10-week class on Scripture and learning the Bible. And on my survey, I say, how well do you know the Bible? Very familiar with, somewhat familiar with, not very familiar with, never read. Which students always check never read? The Roman Catholics. It was just like without fail. It's like, no, the priest deals with that. I don't have to read the Bible. The priest tells me that, right? That's not true of every Roman Catholic parish or anything, but, it was a very common thing. And Luther, one of the reasons Luther translated the New Testament was to get it from, being chained to the pulpit to being put out in the rest of the church for every believer to read. And people got killed for that. Wycliffe got killed for that, translating it. So, all right, we should close. I got to play today. Thanks, Father, for your word. We thank you for these words from Paul. We ask you to give us wisdom and discernment on how to apply them and sometimes how not to apply them to our own personal situations and churches today. Thank you for your word. In Jesus' name, amen.